I had been on the road almost 8 hours when my son opened his front door, stepped outside, and shut it behind him before I could even see my granddaughter. Trevor would not meet my eyes. "Dad, Courtney only wants family here today." For a second, I thought I'd misunderstood him. This was Sophie's first birthday. 3 weeks earlier, Trevor himself had begged me to come. In the back of my truck was the wooden rocking horse I had spent 6 weeks restoring by hand, the same horse his mother and I had made for him when he turned one. I looked past him toward the driveway. Courtney's parents were there. Her sister was there. So were cars I recognized from their neighborhood. Apparently, family had a very specific meaning now. I handed Trevor the horse and left without making a scene. 10 minutes later, I realized I had forgotten Courtney's gift under a blanket in my truck, so I turned around. That was when I saw one curved wooden runner sticking out of the trash beside their garage. My rocking horse, scratched, ribbon buried beneath paper plates and wrapping. Through the front window, everyone was laughing while Courtney's parents unveiled an expensive playhouse. My son was filming it. I took my gift back and drove away. But that birthday was only the beginning. Before this was over, I would learn who had been lying, how long the lies had been going on, and why my own son had been so certain I would forgive him. Months later, I returned with one more gift. When Trevor opened the box, Courtney stopped smiling. "My name is Kenneth Dawson. I was 67 years old, a retired custom cabinet maker from outside Cincinnati, and I had spent most of my life believing that if you built something carefully enough, whether it was a table, a marriage, or a family, it ought to last. My wife, Nancy, had been gone 4 years, and since losing her, my son Trevor and my granddaughter Sophie had become the part of my family I held on to most tightly. 3 weeks before Sophie's first birthday, Trevor called me while I was standing at my workbench. I still remember the sound of his voice over the hum of my old shop fan. "Dad, you're coming, right?" "I mean it. Sophie only gets one first birthday." I told him I wouldn't miss it. By then, I had already started restoring something I had kept wrapped in an old moving blanket for more than 30 years. The little wooden rocking horse Nancy and I had made for Trevor when he turned one. I had replaced one cracked support, tightened every joint, sanded the maple until it felt like satin, and refinished the walnut handles without erasing the tiny dents Trevor had put there as a child. I wanted Sophie to have something that had belonged to her father before she was old enough to know what that meant. I made Courtney something too, a walnut keepsake box with 12 spaces for photographs from Sophie's first year. I wrapped it separately and tucked it beneath a blanket in the back of my truck. The drive from Ohio to North Carolina took me just under 8 hours with fuel, coffee, and 2 stops to stretch my legs. I had booked a small hotel 10 minutes from Trevor's house because I did not want Courtney worrying about sheets, breakfast, or another person in the house with a 1-year-old. I arrived a little before 3 in the afternoon, changed my shirt in the hotel parking lot, checked the ribbon around the rocking horse one last time, and drove over feeling foolishly excited. Balloons were tied to the mailbox. I could hear music before I reached the porch. Then Trevor opened the front door. He did not smile. He stepped outside quickly and pulled the door shut behind him. "Hey, Dad." I looked at him, then at the closed door. "Everything all right?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, it's just." Courtney's a little overwhelmed. Behind him, muffled through the door, I heard several people laughing. "I can stay out of the way," I said. "I've got the hotel. I just wanted to see Sophie, give her the horse, maybe stay for cake." Trevor looked toward the driveway instead of at me. "That's the thing. Courtney wants it really small today. Sophie's been around a lot of people lately, and she doesn't want to overdo it." I followed his glance. Paul and Denise Harper's SUV was parked near the curb. Courtney's sister's white crossover sat behind it. There were at least 3 other cars I did not recognize. I said, "Looks like you've already got a few people." Trevor exhaled through his nose. "They're different. They're around Sophie all the time." I waited. He knew what I was waiting for. Finally, he said, "She only wants family here, Dad. There are sentences that hurt because they are loud, and there are sentences that hurt because they are spoken softly enough that you cannot pretend you heard them wrong." I looked at my son, the boy I had once carried asleep from the car, the man who had called me 3 weeks earlier and told me not to miss this day. "I thought I was family," I said. His face tightened. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Make this harder." He glanced back at the door. "Please, just understand. We'll do something tomorrow. You can come by when everything's calmer." I stood there long enough to realize he was not going to change his mind. So I walked back to the truck, opened the rear hatch, and lifted out the rocking horse. Trevor came down the steps and took it from me. For 1 second I thought he might recognize it. He ran his hand over one of the handles, but his expression never changed. "You made this?" he asked. "Restored it." I almost told him more. I didn't. "It's for Sophie." "Okay. Thanks, Dad." He carried it toward the house. I got back into my truck and drove away. I had gone maybe 10 minutes when I reached over for my hotel keycard and saw the corner of Courtney's wrapped package beneath the blanket on the passenger side floor. I stared at it at the next red light. Mailing it later would have been easier, but I had brought it for her birthday weekend, and despite what had just happened, I did not want to punish Courtney by withholding something I had already made for her. So I turned around. I planned to leave it on the porch and go. That was all. When I pulled back into the neighborhood, I parked farther down the street so Trevor would not think I had returned to argue. I carried Courtney's box up the driveway. The large wheeled trash cart beside the garage was still open from the party cleanup. Something curved above the rim caught my eye. For half a second my mind refused to name it. Then I saw the walnut handle. I set Courtney's gift on the hood of my truck and walked over. The rocking horse was wedged sideways between a black garbage bag, and I had spent my working life repairing furniture, and before touching damaged wood, I had always taken a photograph so I could remember exactly what needed fixing. My hand moved almost from habit. I took out my phone and snapped one picture. Then I lifted the horse free. It was heavier than I remembered carrying it to the porch. I wiped frosting from the side with my handkerchief and set it gently in the truck. I still had Courtney's package in my hand when laughter rolled from the house again. The front picture window faced the driveway. I did not need to creep close or peer around anything. From where I stood, I could see the living room clearly. There were more than a dozen people inside. Courtney was standing beside Sophie, while Paul and Denise pulled a covering from a large, bright playhouse with little shutters and a plastic mailbox. Everyone clapped. Courtney covered her mouth, then hugged her mother. Trevor stood a few feet away holding his phone up, filming the whole thing. Nobody looked toward the driveway. Nobody knew I was there. I looked down at the wrapped box in my hands, then at the rocking horse behind me. I did not knock. I put Courtney's gift back under the blanket, closed the truck, and drove toward the hotel. I had not even reached the next main road when my phone chimed in the cup holder. At a stoplight, I glanced down. Trevor had written, "Thanks for understanding, Dad. We'll just tell everyone the drive was too much for you." By the time I pulled into the hotel parking lot, the sky had gone gray with evening, and Trevor's message was still sitting on my phone like something I had not fully understood yet. I carried the rocking horse into the room myself. One side was scratched, and a faint smear of dried frosting still clung to the ribbon near the front handle. I set it beside the small desk under the window, then placed Courtney's unopened package next to it. For several minutes, I did nothing except stand there looking at both gifts. The horse had been in my family longer than Trevor had been able to form a sentence. Nancy and I made it in the basement of our first house when we were still young enough to believe we could build anything if we stayed up late enough. Trevor was turning 1. Money was tight, and the rocking horses we saw in stores cost more than we could justify. Nancy found a simple pattern in a woodworking magazine and brought it home folded inside her purse. "You can make this," she told me. I remember laughing because I had only recently started doing cabinet work professionally, and she had more confidence in my hands than I did. I shaped the body from maple. Nancy sanded the handles at the kitchen table after Trevor went to sleep. She insisted on helping with the finish, even though she left a faint brush mark near the saddle that bothered me for years. Eventually, I stopped seeing it as a flaw. It was hers. When Trevor outgrew the horse, Nancy would not let me give it away. We wrapped it in a moving blanket and carried it from one house to another for more than 3 decades. After Sophie was born, I considered I could have made something cleaner, smoother, almost perfect. But perfection was not what I wanted to give her. I wanted her to have something her father had once held onto with both hands. So I spent 6 weeks taking the old horse apart without stripping away its history. I replaced what had become unsafe, strengthened the joints, refinished the wood, and left the small dents that belonged to Trevor's childhood. I had imagined telling him all of that while Sophie sat nearby. Instead, the horse was now standing in a hotel room because my son had put it in a trash cart before the party was over. My eyes moved to Courtney's package. I had made that gift because I did not want Sophie's birthday to become one more occasion where everyone focused on the baby and forgot the mother who had carried the first year on her shoulders. The box was walnut, small enough for a dresser, with 12 openings inside for photographs from each month of Sophie's first year. Under the lid, I had tucked a note. I had written that I knew people saw first smiles, first holidays, first steps, but they did not always see the woman who got up in the middle of the night, worried through fevers, packed bottles before work, and still had to walk into an office the next morning, as if she were not exhausted. Courtney had returned to her job when Sophie was only a few months old. I knew that had not been easy. I wanted her to know I respected it. The strange thing was that I had spent more time worrying whether my note sounded too sentimental than I had worrying whether Courtney would appreciate the box. Now she did not even know it existed. My phone rang a little after 8. Trevor. I watched his name flash twice before answering. "You settled in?" he asked. His voice was casual, almost relieved. "I'm at the hotel." "Good. Look, Dad, I know today wasn't ideal." I waited. Courtney was stressed. Sophie was overstimulated. There were just too many moving parts. There were a lot of people in that house. He paused. "That's not really the point. It was the point when you told me the party had to stay small." Trevor sighed. "Can we not turn this into something bigger than it was?" I looked at the horse. "What was it then?" "Bad timing, that's all." He lowered his voice. "Honestly, the easiest thing is just to say the drive got to be too much for you. Nobody needs all the details." There it was again. Not an apology. A solution. And somehow the solution required me to become the reason I had been missing from my own granddaughter's birthday. For most of Trevor's life, I had been good at making rough edges disappear. I knew how to swallow a complaint, soften a story, keep a holiday from becoming uncomfortable. That night, I found I had no appetite for it. "No," I said. Trevor went quiet. "No what?" "If anyone asks me, I'm going to tell them I came." "Dad, come on." "I did come, you know what I mean." "Yes," I said. "I think I finally do." He tried once more to tell me Courtney needed calm and that everyone would forget the whole thing by next week. I told him I was tired and ended the call before he could turn my refusal into another argument. The next morning, I loaded both gifts back into the truck and started north. Somewhere after crossing into Ohio, I stopped for coffee and checked my phone. The family group had several new photographs from Sophie's party. Under them, Trevor had written, "Thanks to everyone who made her first birthday special. Dad couldn't manage the trip after all, but hopefully next time." I read the sentence twice. My son had not merely shut the door on me, he had already started rewriting what happened outside it. By the time I got home that afternoon, Trevor's message in the family group had already collected a row of sympathetic replies. People were telling him they hoped I felt better, saying 8 hours was a long drive at my age, and promising there would be other birthdays. I read every one of them from my kitchen table with my truck keys still in front of me. Then my phone buzzed with a private message from Nancy's younger sister, Linda. "Ken, are you all right? Trevor said you couldn't make the trip. You should have told me you were feeling poorly." I stared at her words for a long time. My first instinct was embarrassingly familiar. I typed, "I'm fine, just got tired and decided it was better not to push myself." It would have ended the conversation. Linda would have worried less. Trevor would have kept his version. Courtney would not be embarrassed. Everyone could move along without an uncomfortable question hanging over the family. My thumb hovered over send. Then I pictured that rocking horse wedged between a garbage bag and torn wrapping paper. I deleted the sentence. I wrote instead, "I made the drive. Trevor asked me to leave when I arrived." Nothing more. No accusation. No photograph. No explanation about the horse. I read it once and sent it. Linda replied almost immediately. "What?" Then another message came. "He told everybody you never got there." I set the phone down. I knew how families worked. One honest sentence could move through relatives faster than 10 polite lies. By early evening, Courtney called. I had expected Trevor. Hearing her voice told me the questions had reached North Carolina. "Kenneth, what exactly are you telling people?" she asked. There was no hello. "The truth if they ask." "Linda called my mother." "I didn't call Linda. She called me." Courtney let out a short breath. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid yesterday." "What were you trying to avoid?" Drama around Sophie's birthday. I leaned back in my chair. I didn't create what happened at your front door. You showed up after we made it clear we were trying to keep things controlled. That stopped me. Trevor asked me 3 weeks ago to come. There was a pause, not long, but long enough for me to hear it. Plans changed, she said. Sophie has been around too many people. I'm her mother. I get to decide what I'm comfortable with. I never said you didn't. Then why are you telling everybody we threw you out? Because Trevor asked me to leave. You make it sound cruel. How would you like me to make it sound? She ignored the question. I have boundaries, Kenneth. You don't get to override them because you drove a long way. I looked out through my kitchen window toward the detached workshop. I could see the outline of the truck with the horse still covered in back. I'm trying to understand the boundary, I said. Trevor told me the party needed to stay small because Sophie had been around too many people. Yes, your parents were there. They see her all the time. Your sister was there. She's family. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in it. There were more than a dozen people in that room, Courtney. Silence. I saw neighbors, friends, people I don't even know. Her voice hardened. Were you standing outside watching us? I came back because I forgot the gift I made for you. That was the truth, and for a moment I wondered if she would ask what gift. She did not. You should have left when Trevor asked you to. I did. Then leave it there. I would have if he hadn't told everyone I never came. Another silence followed. This one felt different. She had run out of explanations that matched what I had seen. When she spoke again, she changed direction. Maybe we all need some space. I knew exactly what that meant, though she did not say Sophie's name. Sunday video calls had become part of my week. Sometimes Sophie only stared at the screen and slapped at Trevor's phone. Sometimes she laughed when I made the same ridiculous clicking sound Nancy used to make with babies. I had photographs of her first tooth, her first trip to the zoo, the afternoon she fell asleep in her high chair. None of those things belonged to me by right. Trevor and Courtney controlled every doorway between Sophie and me. Space from what? I asked. From this pressure, from people questioning us, from you turning one uncomfortable moment into something everybody has to discuss. I answered a question, and now everybody's involved. I could hear Sophie somewhere in the background, making a small, excited squeal. The sound went through me faster than anything Courtney had said. Suddenly, the easiest words in the world were sitting on my tongue. I could have said, "Forget it. I'm sorry. Tell everyone I misunderstood." I could have bought peace in less than 10 seconds. I nearly did. Then I realized whose comfort I would be purchasing and what currency I would be using. My own silence. Courtney, I said, I haven't called anyone. I haven't insulted you. I haven't asked anybody to choose sides, but I'm not going to tell people I stayed home when I didn't. Then don't be surprised if we pull back for a while. My hand tightened around the phone. That's your decision. She seemed to wait for me to retreat. I didn't. Fine, she said, and ended the call. I sat alone at the kitchen table long after the screen went dark. For the first time, telling the truth might cost me the person who had done nothing wrong at all, my granddaughter. The next morning, I uncovered the rocking horse in my workshop and set it beneath the strongest light over my bench. The scratch along the rocker was not deep, but it ran through the finish in a pale line that irritated me every time I looked at it. I had repaired hundreds of pieces of furniture over the years, and I knew damage like that was usually easier to fix than the mistake that caused it. As I ran my thumb over the scrape, I found myself thinking about how often I had done exactly that for Trevor. When he was 13, he broke a neighbor's basement window throwing a baseball where he had been told not to play. He cried more from fear of facing the man next door than from guilt, so I went with him, apologized first, paid for the glass, and let Trevor stand quietly beside me. When he missed an important school deadline years later and blamed a teacher for not reminding him, I called the school and smoothed it over before Nancy could insist he handle it himself. When he damaged my old sedan as a teenager, I made him contribute some of his summer earnings to the repair, but after a few weeks I told him it was enough because I hated watching him worry about money. There were larger things as he got older, missed family dinners, promises to Nancy that somehow became my job to explain, arguments with relatives where I found myself calling people afterward and saying Trevor had not meant what he said. At the time, I had called it protecting my son. Standing in that workshop at 67, I had to admit that sometimes I had protected him from the one thing he probably needed most, the discomfort of making things right himself. Nancy noticed it long before I did. More than once she said, "Ken, you can't keep sanding every rough edge off his life." I usually smiled and told her that was what fathers did. She would shake her head and say, "No, fathers teach their sons how to sand their own." After she died, that distinction became even harder for me to remember. Trevor was my only child. There were days during that first year without Nancy when hearing his voice was the only thing that made the house feel connected to the life I had before. If he forgot to call, I told myself he was busy. If he canceled plans, I rescheduled. If Courtney was short with me, I assumed she was tired. I became so afraid of pushing them away that I started making peace before anyone had asked for it. That morning, with Courtney's warning about space still fresh in my mind, I picked up my phone and opened Trevor's name. I could end this, I thought. I could tell him I did not want Sophie caught in the middle. I could say we had all been upset and that maybe we should just start over. My thumb had almost reached the call button when another call came through. Denise Harper. Courtney's mother had never called me directly before. We were friendly at holidays and family gatherings, but our conversations usually stayed inside the room where they began. I answered, "Denise? Ken, I hope I'm not bothering you." Her voice sounded uncertain. "No, what's going on?" I wanted to ask you something myself instead of hearing it from 3 different people. I sat on the stool beside my bench. "All right. Why did Trevor tell us you refused to come to Sophie's birthday?" For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. "Refused?" "Courtney said the drive was getting to be too much for you and that you weren't comfortable coming." Denise hesitated. "She also said you'd been unhappy with some of the choices they'd made for Sophie, that you didn't approve of how they were doing things." I looked at the horse. "Did she say what choices?" "Not specifically. She made it sound like there had been tension for a while." Denise sounded embarrassed now. "I actually asked if we should move the cake later in the day so you'd have more time to get there. Courtney told me no, that you'd already decided." My grip tightened around the phone. I had been told Courtney wanted a tiny gathering. Her parents had been told I did not want to attend at all. 2 different explanations, both convenient, depending on who was listening. "Denise," I said carefully, "Trevor asked me 3 weeks before the birthday to come. I drove to their house. He met me at the door and asked me to leave." She went completely silent. "You were there?" "Yes." "At the house?" "Yes." "Then why would Courtney tell us you had decided not to come?" "That's something I'm starting to wonder myself." Denise exhaled slowly. "Ken, I'm sorry. Paul and I honestly thought you changed your mind. We expected you. We weren't trying to have some party that excluded you." I believed her. The surprise in her voice was too immediate to sound practiced. "You don't owe me an apology. Somebody owes you an explanation." She paused, then said, "I'm going to call Courtney. I want to hear why she told us something different." I almost told her not to. The old instinct rose immediately. Keep everyone calm. Keep the disagreement contained. Do not make this bigger. This time I let the instinct pass. "That's between you and Courtney," I said. "All I can tell you is what happened to me." We ended the call a few minutes later. I remained on the stool staring at my phone. Almost exactly 10 minutes passed before the screen lit again. Trevor had sent me a message. "Dad, why are you talking to Courtney's mother?" I read it once, then looked at the rocking horse under the shop light. Suddenly, I knew the lie had existed before I ever reached his door. I did not answer Trevor's text right away. For several minutes, I stood beside the workbench with the phone in my hand, reading the same question over and over. "Dad, why are you talking to Courtney's mother?" There was something in the wording that bothered me. Not, "What did Denise say?" Not, "Is something wrong?" He wanted to know why 2 people who had apparently been given different versions of the same birthday were now speaking directly. I called him. He answered on the second ring. "Dad, seriously, what are you doing?" "Talking to Denise." "I know that. Why?" "Because she called me." Trevor sighed. "This is exactly what Courtney didn't want." I pulled the stool closer to the bench and sat down. "What did Courtney want?" "She wanted Sophie's birthday, kept simple." "That's not what I asked." "Dad, come on. You told me Courtney wanted a small gathering. Courtney told her parents I chose not to attend. Those are 2 different stories. Courtney was trying to keep everybody from making a big deal out of it. And what were you trying to do?" She wanted the day to stay calm. There it was again. Courtney wanted. Courtney needed. Courtney decided. I had heard variations of those words for years, usually whenever Trevor called to change Christmas plans or explain why they could not visit. "Trevor," I said, "stop telling me what your wife wanted." He went quiet. "What did you want? What difference does that make?" "A big one. I wanted my wife not to be stressed on our daughter's birthday." "That's still an answer about Courtney." His voice sharpened. "What do you want me to say, Dad?" "I want you to tell me whether you wanted me at Sophie's birthday." There was a pause long enough that I could hear someone moving in the background. Then Courtney's voice came closer. "Is he still going on about this?" Trevor said something away from the phone. A few seconds later, her voice came through clearly. "Kenneth, this needs to stop. I'm trying to understand what happened." "No, you're trying to make Trevor choose between us." I looked at the half-repaired horse. "I'm asking him to speak for himself. You've been judging every decision I make since Sophie was born. Now you're acting shocked that I didn't want that energy at her birthday." That caught me off guard. "What decisions have I judged?" She gave a short laugh. "Seriously?" "Seriously. Going back to work for one." I straightened. "What about it? You told Trevor I was selfish for going back when Sophie was still so young." I knew immediately that something was wrong. Courtney had returned to her job when Sophie was a few months old. Trevor had mentioned the transition to me once, mostly how tired they both were. I remembered telling him it sounded hard on Courtney. I had never called her selfish. Not once. "Courtney, I never said that." "Trevor told me exactly what you said." The room seemed to become very still. "Did you hear me say it?" I asked. "What? Were you there when I supposedly called you selfish?" Trevor cut in fast. "Dad, this is getting ridiculous." His tone was suddenly harder than it had been when we were discussing the birthday, the different stories, or even the lie he posted to the family. "Why?" I asked. "Because now you're picking apart conversations from months ago." Courtney brought it up. "Because you keep pushing her." Courtney said, "I'm not imagining things, Kenneth." "I didn't say you were. I asked whether you heard those words from me." Silence followed. Then Trevor said, "This isn't about her going back to work. It's about you refusing to respect our decisions now." The subject had changed so quickly that I almost followed him. Almost. "Instead," I said, "from now on, neither of you speaks for the other when you talk to me." "What does that even mean?" Trevor asked. "It means if Courtney has something to tell me, Courtney tells me. If you make a decision, you don't tell me your wife made it. You tell me you made it." "You're making rules for our marriage now?" Courtney asked. "No. I'm making rules for conversations that include me." Trevor muttered something under his breath. "And if you told Courtney I said something," I continued, "you had better be certain I actually said it." "Dad, enough. Then answer one thing. Did I call Courtney selfish for going back to work?" He did not answer. Courtney said his name. "Trevor?" He replied too quickly. "I don't remember the exact words. This is pointless." That answer stayed with me after the call ended. Trevor remembered enough to tell Courtney I had judged her, but now that I was asking directly, the exact words had somehow disappeared. I went back to the horse and worked for nearly an hour without getting much done. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Denise. "Ken, one more thing. I've been thinking about the party. I remember seeing Trevor carrying that wooden horse toward the side of the house. I assumed he was putting it somewhere safe while the kids were running around." I read the message twice. Then I looked at the photograph on my phone of the horse inside the trash cart. For the first time, I wondered whether Courtney hated things I had done, or things my son had only told her I had done. I called Denise before I called my son. I wanted to be sure I understood exactly what she had seen, because I had spent too many years making assumptions on Trevor's behalf. "You said you saw him carrying the horse toward the side of the house," I said. "Do you remember when?" Denise thought for a moment. "Not long after the party started. Maybe 15 minutes after you were supposed to arrive. I was helping Courtney's sister bring drinks in from the kitchen." "Did Trevor say anything?" "No. He had the horse under one arm. I assumed he was moving it because there were children running around." "Did Courtney go with him?" "Not that I saw." I thanked her and ended the call before she could ask why the detail mattered. Then I stood in the middle of my workshop looking at the photograph on my phone. The horse was clearly inside the trash cart. not leaning against it, not stored beside it. Inside. I called Trevor. He answered with a tired, irritated "Dad," as though my name had become another problem he needed to manage. "Denise remembers seeing you carry Sophie's horse outside." He was silent for half a second. "Okay, where were you taking it?" "I told you. Courtney didn't want it in the living room during pictures." "You never told me that." "Well, that's what happened." I rested one hand on the workbench. "So where did you put it?" "Outside." "Where outside?" Trevor exhaled. "Dad, does it really matter?" "Yes." "Near the garage." "No." His voice changed. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean it wasn't near the garage. It was inside the trash cart." The line went quiet. I could hear faint television noise in the background. "I found it there myself," I said. "I took a picture before I pulled it out." Trevor did not answer. "Did Courtney put it there?" I asked. "No." The word came quickly. "Did she tell you to throw it away?" Another pause. "Not exactly." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Trevor, she wanted it out of the room." "That isn't what I asked." His voice rose. She had spent weeks planning everything. Her parents brought that playhouse. There were photos. People were posting things. She said the horse looked old and homemade, and she didn't want it sitting there in the middle of everything. I looked at the fresh finish on the rocker beneath my hand. "It was old," I said, "and it was handmade." "You know what I mean." "No, I want you to tell me what you mean." He groaned softly. "It didn't fit the setup, Dad." "So Courtney asked you to move it." "Yes, and you put it in the trash." For the moment, I almost laughed at that, but nothing about it felt funny. For the moment, I was going to get it later. "Then why not put it in the garage?" He said nothing. "Why not put it in a bedroom? Your car? Behind the house? Why a trash cart?" "Because I was trying to get back inside before Courtney got upset." The answer came out fast, almost angrily, and I knew it was probably the closest thing to the truth I had heard from him. "So that was easier." "Dad, it wasn't supposed to become this huge thing. You put something I spent weeks working on in a garbage cart, and I said I was going to get it back." "After what?" "After the party. After the pictures." He did not respond. "After nobody could see it next to the expensive gift." "That's not fair." "Which part?" "You're making it sound like I hated your gift." "I'm telling you where I found it." He lowered his voice. "Courtney was already tense about you being there. I wasn't going to start another fight over a wooden horse. There it was. Another fight with Courtney mattered more than what happened to me, more than what happened to the gift." I asked the question that had been sitting underneath all the others. "Why did you think you could do that to me, and we would still be fine?" He did not answer immediately. "Trevor, you knew I drove 8 hours. You knew I spent weeks on that horse. You knew you were asking me to leave my granddaughter's first birthday. Then you threw her gift away. Why did you think that wouldn't change something between us?" His response was quieter this time. "I figured you'd be mad. And then you'd get over it." I waited. "Why?" Trevor sighed as if the answer should have been obvious. "Because you always do." I did not speak. He must have mistaken my silence for confusion because he continued. "Come on, Dad. We've had disagreements before. You cool off. Everybody moves on. That's what you do." I looked at the horse and thought about every time I had called first, apologized first, explained first, forgiven before he had done anything to earn it. Trevor had not forgotten those years. He had learned from them, just not the lesson I thought I was teaching. "I need to go," I said. "Dad, don't make this worse." "I'm not." I ended the call and set the phone down beside the photograph of the horse in the trash. Courtney wanted my gift out of sight, but my son put it in the trash because he believed my love would protect him from the consequences. The next morning, I went back to the workshop before breakfast and turned on the lights over my bench. Trevor's last words from the night before were still with me. "Because you always do." I did not want to think about what they meant yet, so I gave my hands something they understood better. I set the rocking horse on its side and began removing the saddle so I could reach the damaged joint beneath it. The screws were old but solid. I had replaced some hardware during the restoration, but I had deliberately left several original pieces untouched whenever they were still safe. When the saddle lifted free, a faint set of pencil marks appeared on the underside. At first I thought they were measurements I had made years ago. Then I recognized the slant of the handwriting. Nancy. The letters had faded until they were almost the same color as the wood. Trevor, first birthday. Below that was another line. Kitchen fall, fixed by Ken. I sat down. There was nothing dramatic about the words. Nancy had always labeled things: Christmas boxes, school projects, jars of screws, old photographs. She believed memory was unreliable and a pencil was cheap insurance. But seeing her handwriting beneath that saddle felt as if someone had opened a small door into our old kitchen. I remembered Trevor tipping the horse sideways because he tried to climb onto it from the wrong direction. Nancy screamed before he even hit the linoleum. Trevor cried for perhaps 30 seconds, then became more upset because the horse had a loose rocker. I repaired it that evening while Nancy held the flashlight and told me I was taking too long. More than 30 years later, I had repaired the same horse again because our son had thrown it into a trash cart. I went into the house and pulled an old photo album from the cabinet under the stairs. Nancy had organized them by year, of course. I found Trevor's first birthday after only a few minutes. There he was in striped overalls, sitting on the horse with both hands wrapped around the handles. His mouth was open in a laugh. Nancy knelt beside him with one hand hovering near his back in case he leaned too far. She was young enough in the picture that for a second I forgot how many years had passed. There was no party decoration worth remembering. No expensive present in the frame, just a little boy, his mother, and something his parents had made for him. I took the photograph back to the workshop and placed it beside the horse. Then another realization came to me. Trevor had held that gift on Sophie's birthday. He had run his hand across one of the handles. He had asked me if I made it. He had not recognized it. I could not decide which hurt more, that he had thrown it away, or that the thing Nancy and I had preserved for him all those years had disappeared so completely from his memory that he could throw it away without knowing what it was. I reminded myself that children do not remember every object their parents save. Trevor had been one. It would have been unfair to expect him to recognize every curve of the horse decades later. Still, I had carried the memory for both of us. That was what fathers often did. The question I was beginning to ask was whether I had carried too many other things for him as well. I opened a storage cabinet looking for a small envelope of old photographs I sometimes kept near the shop, and beneath a stack of instruction manuals, I found an older phone I had saved after upgrading. I charged it out of curiosity more than intention. Most of the messages had been transferred years ago, but scrolling through an old conversation with Trevor brought me to a disagreement I barely remembered. It had been about Christmas, 2 years before Sophie was born. Trevor had complained that Courtney wanted to spend the entire holiday with her parents. He wanted Christmas morning at home, but did not want to tell her because he thought she would accuse him of disliking her family. I had answered, "If you disagree with Courtney, tell her yourself. Don't use me as the reason." At the time, I thought that settled it. I remembered Trevor later telling me everything had worked out. I had never asked how. Now I read my own sentence again. Don't use me as the reason. Why had I written that? There must have been something in his earlier messages that made me think he was considering exactly that. I scrolled upward. Trevor had written, "Maybe I'll just tell her you were hoping we'd come to Ohio. She won't argue with that." I had forgotten the exchange because it seemed minor then. A young husband avoiding an awkward conversation, nothing more. But after what Courtney had said about me calling her selfish for going back to work, the old message no longer felt minor. I set the phone beside the photograph of Trevor on the rocking horse. At the far end of the bench sat Courtney's unopened walnut box, still wrapped in the paper I had chosen for Sophie's birthday. I had 3 objects in front of me now, each from a different time, and all of them seemed to be asking the same question. One old text made me wonder whether the birthday was not the first time Trevor had hidden his own opinions behind my name. Courtney called me 2 days later, and this time there was no anger in her opening words. That almost made the conversation harder. "Kenneth, I want to understand something," she said. I was in the workshop with the old phone, the photograph, and the rocking horse still spread across my bench. "All right." She hesitated. "Why have you always had such a problem with me?" I leaned against the edge of the table. "I don't think I have." She gave a tired laugh. "You thought I was selfish for going back to work. You thought the nursery was ridiculous. You didn't like the daycare we chose. You complained that my parents were at our house too much." One by one, the examples landed in places I recognized. Not because I had said those things to Courtney, but because Trevor had said versions of them to me. When Sophie was 3 months old, Trevor called one evening and complained that he was exhausted because Courtney had gone back to work. I told him she was probably exhausted too. Months earlier, when they were decorating the nursery, Trevor sent me pictures of expensive furniture and said, "This is getting out of control." I told him if the cost bothered him, he needed to talk to his wife. He had complained about daycare prices. He had complained that Paul and Denise came over without calling. I had listened because I was his father. Apparently, somewhere between my phone and his marriage, those complaints had acquired my name. "Courtney," I said, "did you hear me say any of those things?" Trevor told me. "That's not what I asked." She went quiet. "Did I ever say to you that you were selfish for going back to work?" "No." "But was I in the room when somebody said the nursery was a waste of money?" "No." "Did I ever call you about your parents visiting too much?" Another silence. "No." I picked up the old phone from the bench. "Then maybe we need to separate what I said from what Trevor told you," I said. Her voice changed. Not softer exactly, more cautious. "Are you saying he made all of it up?" "I'm saying I want to look at what actually happened." I opened the message thread I had found the day before and scrolled farther. There it was. Trevor had sent me a picture of the nursery furniture with the price circled. "Courtney says this is the one she wants. This is insane." My answer was directly beneath it. "If you think it costs too much, talk to Courtney. It's your household. Don't make me the excuse," Trevor had replied with a thumbs up. I read the messages aloud. Courtney said nothing for several seconds. Then she said, "He told me you said we were wasting money trying to impress people." I closed my eyes. "I never said that." "He said you thought my parents were showing off." "I never said that either." I could hear movement on her end, then Trevor's voice in the background asking who she was talking to. Courtney did not answer him immediately. "What about daycare?" she asked me. "Trevor called me because he thought it was expensive. He told me you said I picked the most expensive place because I care about appearances." "No." Trevor's voice came closer. "Courtney, give me the phone." She ignored him. "And my parents?" "He complained that they came over without calling. I told him if it bothered him, he should ask them to call first. Trevor told me you said they were taking over our family." "I didn't." "Courtney, stop," Trevor said sharply. This time I heard him clearly. "Why?" she asked. "Because this is ridiculous. He's going through old conversations trying to make me look bad." I said, "I didn't call her. She called me." Trevor must have taken the phone because his voice suddenly came through louder. "Dad, what are you trying to do? Answer questions. You're digging through years of private conversations, because apparently some of those conversations became my opinions after they reached your house. People paraphrase things. That isn't paraphrasing. You're trying to turn Courtney against me." I looked down at the message on the old screen. "Don't make me the excuse." I had written it before Sophie was born, back when I thought I was warning my son about one small act of cowardice. "Trevor, how many times did you tell Courtney I thought something when you were the one who thought it?" "That's insane." "Then answer me." "I'm not doing this." Courtney said something I could not make out. Trevor snapped back at her, then returned to me. "You don't understand what you're doing to my marriage." The sentence would once have stopped me. I would have apologized simply for causing tension between them, even if I had not caused the problem. Instead, I said, "I'm not destroying your marriage. I'm stopping you from using me to hold it together." He went silent. So did Courtney. I ended the call before either of them could hand me responsibility for what happened next. For years, I thought my son was trapped between his wife and his father. Now I knew he had built that wall himself and hidden behind it. Thanksgiving arrived before any of us had figured out what to do with the truth. By then, Courtney knew that several opinions she had resented me for were never mine. Trevor knew I had found the old messages, and I knew enough to stop accepting Courtney wants as an explanation for anything my son chose to do. Denise called me the week before the holiday. "Paul and I want you here," she said. "I mean that, Ken. No messages through anybody else. I'm asking you myself." I thanked her, and for a few minutes I seriously considered making the drive. Then Trevor called that evening. "Dad, about Thanksgiving." I already knew from his tone that he was about to tell me what someone else wanted. "Courtney's not ready for this," he said. "For what?" "For everybody sitting around pretending nothing happened." I wouldn't pretend nothing happened. He sighed. That's exactly what I mean. Can you just give her one holiday? I looked at the calendar on my kitchen wall. Your mother-in-law invited me. I know, Mom's upset. Denise isn't your mom. Trevor went quiet. You know what I mean. No, Trevor. I'm getting tired of knowing what everyone means instead of hearing what they say. He told me Courtney needed time, that the holiday should be peaceful, that Sophie should not be around tension. It was the birthday all over again. Only this time I could see the pattern before I stepped into it. I told him I would not force myself into anyone's home, but I would not take responsibility for an invitation someone else wanted withdrawn. Then I called Denise back and politely declined. You shouldn't have to stay away because Courtney is uncomfortable, she said. Maybe not, I answered, but I'm done showing up where somebody has to decide whether I belong. I expected Thanksgiving to feel empty after that. Instead, I made a decision I should have made years earlier. I invited Linda, Nancy's sister, 2 men from the woodworking group, and an old neighbor whose children were spending the holiday out west. I cooked more than I had cooked since Nancy died. The turkey was a little dry, the rolls were store-bought, and nobody cared. We sat around my dining table telling stories that had nothing to do with Trevor, Courtney, or who had been excluded from what. At one point, Linda laughed so hard she had to put down her fork, and I caught myself listening to the sound, as if I had forgotten laughter could happen in my house without my son being there. After everyone left, I stood in the kitchen surrounded by mismatched containers and dirty plates and realized something had shifted. I had not spent the day waiting for a photograph from North Carolina. I had made my own holiday. Trevor called the next afternoon. His voice was different, softer. How was Thanksgiving? Good. Yeah? He paused. Listen, Dad. I've been thinking. We handled the birthday badly. I did not speak. It was the closest he had come to saying anything plainly. I should have dealt with it differently, he continued. Courtney was stressed. I was trying to keep everybody happy. It got out of hand. It did. Another pause. Then he said, You want to see Sophie? My throat tightened before I could stop it. Of course I do. A few minutes later, my screen filled with my granddaughter's face. She was sitting on the floor in pajamas, banging 2 plastic cups together while Trevor held the phone. She looked at me, then grinned when I made the clicking noise she remembered. For 5 minutes, nothing else mattered. I told myself maybe this was how repair started, not with some grand apology, but with one person making the first decent move. After Trevor ended the video call, he stayed on the phone. Dad, there's just one thing I need from you. I should have heard the warning in that sentence. What? Can you clear something up with the family? About what? The horse. My chest tightened. What about it? People are acting like we literally threw your gift away. It's making Courtney look horrible. You did throw it away. Come on, you know I was going to get it back. It was inside the trash cart. Temporarily. I closed my eyes. What are you asking me to say? Just tell Linda and whoever else is talking that nobody actually threw anything away. Say it got moved during the party and you misunderstood. There it was, the apology, the video call, the gentler voice. They had all led to the same place. Trevor, I said, then you aren't asking me to forgive you. You're asking me to lie for you again. Dad, that's not fair. It's exactly what you asked. He started explaining how embarrassed Courtney was, how her parents were upset, how the whole thing had become bigger than it needed to be. I stopped him. No, it became bigger because the truth and the story you wanted told were 2 different things. We ended the call badly. That evening, while I was putting leftovers away, Linda sent me a screenshot. Courtney had posted a polished Thanksgiving photograph online. Trevor stood behind her with one hand on her shoulder. Sophie was between Denise and Paul. Everyone was smiling beneath the caption. So grateful to have our whole family together. Beneath it, Denise had written one short comment. Not quite the whole family. A few minutes later, the comment disappeared. Courtney had deleted it. I stared at the empty space where it had been. They did not want me back in the family. They wanted me back inside the story they preferred telling about it. The photograph Courtney posted on Thanksgiving did more than erase me from one holiday. It gave people permission to ask questions she and Trevor had spent weeks trying to avoid. By the following Monday, Linda had sent me 2 messages from relatives, wondering what had really happened at Sophie's birthday. I answered only what I was asked. I did not send the picture of the rocking horse. I did not tell anyone what Trevor had admitted. I kept thinking there was a difference between correcting a lie and humiliating my son, and I still wanted to stay on the right side of that difference. Courtney made that harder. A message appeared in the extended family group late one evening. She wrote that the situation had been blown completely out of proportion and that I had become attached to a version of events that made everyone look worse than they were. Then she added, "Kenneth didn't even bring Sophie a normal birthday present. It was an old woodworking project he expected us to find space for." I read that sentence 3 times. The word that stayed with me was not old. It was normal. As if 6 weeks of my hands on something meant less because it had not arrived in a box from a store. Denise responded before I did. "Was that the wooden horse Trevor carried outside during the party?" Courtney answered. "Yes. It was an old toy from Ken's garage. There wasn't room for it with everything else." I looked across the workshop at the horse. The damaged rocker had been repaired now, but I had not refinished the entire piece. I wanted the old marks to remain old marks. A second message from Courtney appeared. "Nobody threw away some precious family heirloom. It was moved during cleanup, and this whole thing has gotten ridiculous." That was the moment my silence changed meaning. Until then, I had believed keeping the photograph private was restraint. Now it was helping Courtney replace what happened with something easier to defend. I picked up my phone and opened the picture I had taken beside their garage. The horse was wedged diagonally inside the trash cart. One rocker scraped pale where it had rubbed against the plastic, wrapping paper, and a black garbage bag beneath it. There was no angle that made it look like storage. I sat with the photograph for several minutes before touching anything. I did not want to write an angry paragraph. I did not want to tell the family what kind of people I thought Trevor and Courtney were. If the picture needed a speech, then maybe I should not send it, so I wrote 2 sentences. "I made this for Trevor's first birthday. I spent 6 weeks restoring it for Sophie's." Then I attached the photograph. My thumb rested over "send" longer than it should have. Nancy would have told me not to confuse peace with pretending. I pressed it. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. Then the little typing indicators appeared and disappeared beneath the conversation. Linda sent, "Oh, Ken." One cousin wrote, "That was in the trash?" Denise did not ask a question. She simply wrote, "I'm sorry, we did not know." Courtney stopped responding. Trevor called less than 5 minutes later. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice was loud enough that I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear. Answering what Courtney said, "You posted that picture to the whole family." "Yes." "Do you have any idea what this looks like?" I turned toward the horse. "It looks like where I found it." "That's exactly what I mean. You're making us look horrible." "Trevor, which part of what I posted is untrue?" He went quiet. "Did I make the horse for your first birthday? That's not the point. Did I spend 6 weeks restoring it? Dad. Was it inside the trash cart when I came back?" His breathing became heavier. "I already explained that. Then tell me which sentence was false." He did not answer. Instead, he said, "You're enjoying this." That surprised me more than the anger. "No, you finally get to make everybody take your side." "I haven't asked anyone to take a side. You posted a picture you knew would make Courtney look like some kind of monster. Courtney told everyone the horse was never thrown away. Because it wasn't meant to stay there. The photograph doesn't say what you meant. It shows what you did." Trevor swore under his breath. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said quieter, "Fine, keep doing this if that's what you want." "Doing what?" "Making everything public, making Courtney miserable, making me explain myself to everybody. You could stop explaining and start telling the truth." He hung up. I stood there staring at the dark screen, expecting anger to be the end of it. It wasn't. About 20 minutes later, my phone chimed again. Trevor had sent a video. Sophie was taking small, uncertain steps between their couch and coffee table, arms lifted for balance. She made it 3 steps before falling onto her diaper and laughing. I watched it twice. Then I saw the message beneath it. "Keep this up, and eventually she won't even know who you are." I sat down slowly on the stool beside my bench. The threat was not hidden behind Courtney this time. There was no talk about boundaries, stress, or keeping Sophie comfortable. My son had finally named the price of my silence: access to my granddaughter. The following Sunday came and went without a video call. I told myself Sophie might be tired, or Trevor and Courtney might have taken her somewhere for the afternoon. The next Sunday passed the same way. By the third week, I stopped pretending it was accidental. My phone stayed quiet except for ordinary messages from Linda and a few people from the woodworking group. No pictures of Sophie at breakfast. No short videos of her pulling books from a shelf or banging a spoon against her high chair. I had grown used to those little pieces of her week without realizing how much they mattered until they disappeared. One Sunday afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in front of me and opened a message to Trevor. I typed, "I'm sorry this got so out of hand." The sentence looked reasonable. Mature, even. It would cost me nothing to send it. Maybe Trevor would answer. Maybe that evening I would hear Sophie laugh through a screen again. My thumb hovered over the button. Then I read the message a second time. What exactly was I apologizing for? For driving 8 hours after being invited? For refusing to pretend I never arrived? For showing a photograph after Courtney publicly said the horse had never been thrown away? I realized that if I sent those words, Trevor would learn something far more important than whether I was sorry. He would learn that 3 weeks without Sophie was enough to bring me back into line. I deleted the message. It hurt more than I expected. I loved that little girl. I would have driven twice as far just to sit on the floor while she ignored me and played with a cardboard box. But love for Sophie could not become a handle Trevor pulled whenever he wanted me silent. I wrote something else. I will never involve Sophie in an argument between adults, and I will never speak badly about either of you to her. But I will not bargain for my place as her grandfather. Trevor did not answer until that evening. "Nobody's asking you to bargain," I called him. He picked up after several rings. "You told me she might not know who I am if I keep telling the truth." I was angry. Was it true? "Dad, you're making everything sound worse than it is." "Then tell me what it is." He sighed. "Courtney doesn't want to keep dealing with this every week. Neither do I. Neither do I." "Then stop." "Stop what?" "Dragging the birthday back up. Posting pictures. Comparing old messages with my wife." "You mean stop correcting things that aren't true?" His voice tightened. "You always have to phrase it like that." "Because that's what happened." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could feel the old instinct returning, the one that told me to soften my voice, offer him an exit, tell him I understood how difficult marriage and parenthood could be. Instead, I asked the question I had been carrying since the day Denise called. "Trevor, why were you so sure I would leave quietly that day?" "What?" "At Sophie's birthday. You knew I had driven all that way. You knew you had invited me. You knew there were people inside after you told me the party needed to be small. Why were you so sure I would just take the horse and go?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do." He became defensive. "What answer are you looking for?" "The honest one." His frustration finally broke through. "Because you always understand, Dad. You always have." The words landed quietly. That was the worst part. They sounded almost affectionate. I remembered Trevor at 16 after damaging my car, saying, "Thanks for understanding." Trevor in college after missing Nancy's birthday dinner. "I knew you'd understand." Trevor years later after canceling Christmas plans at the last minute. "You understand how Courtney's family is." Every time I had heard gratitude. Standing in my kitchen that night, I heard something else. Permission. "Is that what you told Courtney before Sophie's birthday?" I asked. Trevor went silent. "Trevor." She was upset. "That isn't an answer. She said she didn't want you there if you were going to criticize everything, and you knew those criticisms weren't mine." Another long pause. "Some of them weren't." "What did you tell her?" He exhaled hard. "I told her I'd handle it." "How?" "I said you wouldn't make a scene." "Why?" "Because I told her you'd understand." There it was. He had not defended me. He had not corrected the things he had blamed on me. He had simply promised Courtney that the father he had used as an excuse would also cooperate with being excluded. "You could have told her the truth," I said. "About the nursery, about her going back to work, about her parents. Then I'd have had to explain everything." "Yes. You don't get how hard that would have been." I almost told him I did understand. The words rose automatically. I stopped them. "No," I said. "I think that's exactly what you were counting on." We ended the call without fixing anything. I sat alone for a long time afterward, thinking about Nancy's warning that I could not sand every rough edge off our son's life. I had spent my life believing understanding made me a good father. My son had spent his life believing it meant he would never have to answer to me. Christmas came closer without bringing the easy peace people like to promise this time of year. Trevor and I had spoken only once since our last conversation, and neither of us mentioned Sophie. Then Denise called me one evening while I was cleaning sawdust from the floor of my workshop. "Paul and I are having everyone here for Christmas," she said. "And before you ask, I'm calling you myself. You are invited because we want you here." I appreciated the way she said it. No message passed through Trevor. No explanation about what Courtney might prefer. "Thank you," I said. "I need to ask one thing before I say yes." "Go ahead." "If I come, nobody tells people Sophie's birthday was a misunderstanding. Nobody says I decided to leave. I'm not asking for a public apology. I'm just not walking into another room where the price of keeping things comfortable is pretending something different happened." Denise was quiet for a moment. "That's fair." Later that night, Trevor called. "Mom said you're coming for Christmas." I knew he meant Denise and chose not to correct him this time. I told her I would. "Courtney wants to move forward." "So do I." "Good. Moving forward isn't the same as changing what's behind us." Trevor sighed. "Can we just have one day without going through all of it again?" "That depends on whether anybody tries to rewrite it again." He did not argue after that. A few days later, Courtney sent me a short message of her own. "I hope Christmas can be a fresh start." I read it twice. There was no apology in the sentence, but there was also no accusation. I decided to accept it for what it was, and nothing more. I wrote back, "I hope it can be honest." Then I went to the workshop. I had been thinking about a second gift for several weeks, although calling it a gift felt strange at first. I did not want to punish Trevor with some clever surprise or embarrass Courtney in front of her parents. I had no interest in arriving with a box full of anger. What I wanted was much harder to dismiss. I wanted them to see the pieces of the story together, without my having to argue about what any of them meant. I chose walnut for the chest because it was the same wood I had used for Courtney's keepsake box. The boards had been sitting against the wall for nearly a year, dark-grained and straight. I cut simple panels, joined the corners, fitted a modest brass hinge, and sanded everything until the lid closed with almost no sound. I did not carve anyone's name into it. I did not want the box to announce its purpose before it was opened. When the finish dried, I began choosing what belonged inside. The first thing was the photograph from Trevor's first birthday. I made a clean copy so the original could stay safely in my album. In the picture, Trevor sat on the rocking horse with Nancy kneeling beside him, one hand raised behind his back as if she expected him to tip over at any second. I placed it flat against the bottom of the chest. Next came a small strip of ribbon from Sophie's birthday. I had found it tangled around the horse when I pulled it from the trash cart. I had nearly thrown it away during the repair, but something stopped me. It was wrinkled now, with a faint stain where frosting had dried into the fabric. Beside it, I placed a photograph of the pencil writing beneath the saddle. Trevor's name. First birthday. Nancy's note about the old kitchen fall and my repair. I could have removed the saddle and brought the entire horse to Christmas, but that would have turned the evening into a performance. A photograph was enough. Then I picked up Courtney's gift. It had remained on the far end of my workbench since September, still wrapped in the paper I had chosen before any of this happened. I had never opened it. I had never changed the note inside. That mattered to me. Whatever Courtney eventually read would be exactly what I had intended to give her before I knew I would be shut out of Sophie's birthday. I placed the package at the bottom of the chest, beneath the photograph and ribbon, where it would be the last thing they found. For a while I stood there with the lid open, wondering if I was being too deliberate. Nancy had always been suspicious of speeches disguised as gestures. If she had been there, she probably would have told me to make sure the gift was for understanding, not victory. So I wrote only one new card. No accusations, no explanation. Just one sentence. The first gift was for Sophie. This one is for her parents. I set the card on top and closed the lid. For months they had argued about what my first gift was worth. At Christmas I was going to show them what they had actually thrown away. The drive to the Harper's house felt different from the one I had made in September. I was carrying another handmade gift, but this time I was not imagining applause, gratitude, or even forgiveness. I only wanted the truth to survive the day intact. The walnut chest sat buckled into the passenger seat beside me, wrapped in plain brown paper. When I pulled into the driveway, Denise opened the front door before I reached the porch. "Ken," she said, and hugged me without hesitation. Paul shook my hand behind her. Neither of them acted as if my presence required permission from anyone else. Courtney appeared from the hallway carrying Sophie. For a second, we simply looked at each other. Then Sophie heard my voice. "Well, there's my girl." Her head turned sharply. She stared at me, serious at first, then broke into a grin that showed the tiny gap between her front teeth. She leaned forward in Courtney's arms and reached one hand toward me. After weeks without our Sunday calls, that small movement hit harder than I expected. Courtney shifted Sophie toward me. "She remembers you." I was hoping she would. I held my granddaughter carefully while she grabbed at the collar of my shirt. Nothing about the room felt repaired, but for those few minutes, I let myself enjoy what was real. Dinner was polite. Too polite. Courtney asked about my drive. Trevor asked whether I had finished any new woodworking projects. Nobody mentioned September. Nobody mentioned the photograph, the family messages, or the weeks Sophie had disappeared from my screen. I did not force the subject. I had promised myself I would not arrive looking for a fight. After dessert, Courtney stood and clapped her hands lightly. "Before everybody leaves, I want a family picture." People began moving toward the living room fireplace. Paul adjusted a lamp. Denise picked Sophie up from the floor. Trevor came over and motioned for me to stand beside him. Courtney smiled as she arranged everyone. "It's good to have everybody back together." The sentence was meant to sound warm. Maybe part of her even believed it. I stayed where I was. Trevor lowered his hand. "Dad?" Courtney looked at me. "Kenneth, come on." "We're waiting," I said. "I'm happy to take a picture, but I'm not comfortable pretending we're back together when we haven't actually repaired anything." The room went quiet in that awkward way families know well, when people suddenly become interested in cups, napkins, or anything that keeps them from looking directly at the problem. Courtney's smile tightened. She stepped closer to me and lowered her voice. "Please, not in front of my parents." I looked at her for a moment. "Your parents are the people you used as the reason I wasn't family." Her face changed. "That's not fair." Denise, standing a few feet away with Sophie on her hip, said, "Courtney." Courtney turned. "Mom, please." Denise did not raise her voice. "No. Ken is right about one thing. Paul and I were told he chose not to come. He was told something completely different. I don't want our names used in another explanation." Trevor stepped forward. "Can we just take the picture?" I looked at him. "You can, I'm not stopping anyone." He rubbed his forehead. "Dad, what do you want?" "The truth stated once. By you. We've talked about this. Privately." Courtney folded her arms. "So now he has to perform an apology?" "I didn't ask for an apology." I kept my eyes on Trevor. I asked him to say what happened. Denise said quietly, "Trevor, just say it." Paul did not speak, but he remained beside his wife. Trevor looked around the room, and I could see the same expression he had worn at the front door in September, the look of a man searching for the fastest way out of discomfort. This time there was no door to close behind him. "Fine," he said. Then he looked at me. "Dad drove down for Sophie's birthday." Nobody moved. Trevor continued. "He came to the house." Courtney stared at the floor, and I asked him to leave. Linda, standing near the end of the couch, said nothing, but I saw her lips pressed together. Trevor swallowed. He didn't decide the drive was too much. He didn't cancel. That was enough. I did not ask him to explain Courtney. I did not make him describe the trash cart or the message he sent afterward. The point was not to stretch his humiliation. The point was that, for once, my son had said his own part aloud without placing it inside someone else's mouth. I nodded. "Thank you." Courtney looked at me as if she had expected more. Maybe anger would have been easier for her. Instead, I walked to the chair where I had left the wrapped walnut chest. I picked it up and carried it across the room. Trevor looked down at the package when I placed it in his hands. "What's this?" he asked. "There's one more gift," I told my son. "This one belongs to you and Courtney." Trevor held the walnut chest for several seconds before pulling at the brown paper. Nobody spoke. Even Sophie had gone quiet in Denise's arms, distracted by the ribbon hanging from the package. Trevor opened the lid and looked down. At first, his face showed only confusion. Then he reached inside and lifted out the photograph. I watched his eyes move from the little boy sitting on the rocking horse to the woman kneeling beside him. "Mom," he said. The word came out so softly I almost did not hear it. He turned the photograph toward the light. "That's me?" Your first birthday. Trevor stared at it again. In the picture, he had both hands around the wooden handles, his mouth wide open in a laugh, while Nancy kept one hand close to his back. He looked from the photograph to me. That horse. Yes. He stopped. I could see the answer arriving before he said it. Sophie's horse was mine? I nodded. Your mother and I made it for you. Courtney shifted beside him. Until then, she had treated the rocking horse as something I had brought from my workshop, a handmade object that could be moved out of sight without losing anything important. Now she was looking at Trevor's childhood sitting in his hands. I didn't know, Trevor said. No, I answered. You didn't. He lowered the photograph and found the next item, a copy of the faded pencil marks beneath the saddle. Trevor read his own name, then the date. He frowned at the line beneath it. Kitchen fall, fixed by Ken. For the first time that evening, he gave a small, involuntary smile. I don't remember that. You were barely more than a baby. You tried to climb on from the side and tipped the whole thing over. His eyes remained on Nancy's handwriting. She wrote this? She labeled almost everything. Trevor ran his thumb along the edge of the photograph. Why didn't you tell me it was mine when you brought it? I thought I would tell you inside. The answer ended his smile. He knew there had been no inside for me that day. He reached back into the chest and found the strip of ribbon. It had once been bright, but frosting had dried into one section, and the fabric had stayed wrinkled even after I cleaned it. Trevor recognized it immediately. I could tell by the way his hand stopped. That was on the horse. Yes. The room stayed silent. No one needed me to explain why that strip of ribbon was sitting beside a photograph from his first birthday. Denise finally spoke. Trevor, who put Sophie's horse in the trash? Courtney's head turned toward him. Trevor looked at his mother-in-law, then at me. There was no quick answer this time. No, Courtney wanted. No, Dad misunderstood. He swallowed. I did. Denise's expression tightened. You? Yes. Courtney stepped in quickly. I told him to move it. I did not tell him to throw it away. I looked at her. That's true. She seemed surprised I had agreed. Then I continued. You told him you didn't want it in the pictures. Courtney folded her arms. Because it didn't fit. There were already gifts everywhere, and my parents had brought the playhouse. I wanted the pictures to look nice. That does not mean I wanted something important destroyed. You thought it was important enough to remove from the pictures. Her face flushed. I thought it was an old wooden toy. It was an old wooden toy. I kept my voice level. That wasn't the problem, Trevor said. Dad, I already told you I was going to get it back. And I already told you that doesn't change where you put it. Courtney looked at Trevor. Why didn't you put it in the garage? Trevor rubbed his forehead. Because you were upset. Everybody was waiting. I just wanted to get back inside. So you threw it away? Denise asked. For a few minutes. Trevor, I said, stop trying to make the amount of time matter. He looked at me. I didn't think it would become permanent. You didn't think what would become permanent? The horse being in the trash? Or what it did to us? His jaw tightened. I knew you'd be angry. And I thought you'd forgive me. There it was again, the belief that had followed us through his whole life. I looked at the photograph still in his hand. Forgiveness isn't pretending something never happened. I know that now. I hope you do, Courtney said quietly. You're making it sound like we knew what that horse was. You didn't know its history. I looked at both of them. But you knew who made it. You knew who drove it down here. You knew it was made for your daughter. That should have been enough to keep it out of the garbage. Neither of them answered. That mattered more to me than an argument would have. Trevor looked back into the chest. He moved the photograph and ribbon aside, then stopped. One package remained at the bottom, wrapped in the same paper I had used in September. Courtney's name was written across the tag in my handwriting. Trevor lifted it slowly. Courtney stared at the gift she should have opened on Sophie's birthday, and the smile left her face before she even untied the ribbon. Courtney held the package in both hands for a moment before opening it. The paper came away more slowly than I expected, as if she already understood that whatever was inside had been wrapped before any of us knew how badly Sophie's birthday would end. When the walnut box appeared, she looked at me, then down at the words I had burned lightly into the lid. Sophie's first year. She ran her fingers across them and opened it. Inside were 12 small spaces, one for each month of Sophie's first year. I had sized them for ordinary photographs, nothing fancy. Beneath the first compartment was the envelope with Courtney's name on it. She recognized my handwriting from the tag. "This was for me?" she asked. "Yes." She opened the envelope and unfolded the note. I watched her eyes move across the page. I remembered writing every line at my kitchen table weeks before the birthday. I had thanked her for bringing Sophie into my life. I had written that first birthdays usually celebrated how much a child had grown, but almost nobody stopped to count the nights a mother had been awake, the appointments she remembered, the bottles she washed, the mornings she left for work tired and came home to start another shift as a parent. Courtney had returned to her job sooner than some people expected, and I knew from Trevor's own complaints how difficult the transition had been. My last line said I hoped Sophie would someday understand that having a mother who worked outside the home did not mean she had been given less love. It meant Courtney had carried more than most people saw. At the top of the page, beside the date, was a day in September before I ever left Ohio. Courtney read the note twice. The second time her face changed. She looked at the date again, then at Trevor. "You told me he thought I went back too soon." Trevor's shoulders stiffened. "Courtney, you told me he said I was selfish." "That's not exactly what I said." She gave him a look I had never seen her give me. "It is exactly what you said." Trevor glanced toward the rest of the room, uncomfortable with everyone listening. "We've already talked about this." "No, you and your father talked about it. I'm asking you now." She held up the note. "He wrote this before the birthday, before any of this happened." Trevor rubbed his hands together. "I might have repeated things wrong." "Wrong?" Courtney asked. "Or differently?" He did not answer. Her voice remained controlled, but every word became more deliberate. "How many times did you tell me something was your father's opinion when it was really yours?" Trevor looked at me as though I had set a trap for him. I had not. That was the point. The note in Courtney's hand existed before the trap would have had a reason to exist. "Dad complained about things too," he said. "I complained to my son," I replied. "That is not the same as asking you to blame me for what you didn't want to say to your wife." Courtney turned back to me. The anger had left her face. What remained looked closer to embarrassment. I didn't know. I believed her, but believing that did not erase the rest. "You could have asked," I said. She lowered her eyes. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then I continued, because this was the moment when it would have been easiest for everyone to choose one villain and one victim. That would not have been honest either. "Trevor lied to you because he was afraid to disagree with you. That part belongs to him." Trevor looked away. "But you had my number, Courtney. You saw me at holidays. You could have asked whether I said those things. Instead, you believed what made it easier to keep me at a distance." She nodded once, barely. "I know. And the birthday wasn't Trevor alone. He put the horse in the trash, but you wanted it out of the pictures. You told your parents I decided not to come, and when I corrected that, you threatened distance between me and Sophie." Courtney's face tightened at Sophie's name. "I was angry. So was I. I didn't use Sophie against you." That landed differently. Trevor started to say something, but I held up my hand. "I'm not doing this to punish either of you. I'm telling you what has to change if we're going to have any kind of relationship after tonight." I looked at Trevor first. "You do not tell Courtney I said something unless I said it. If you have an opinion, you own it." Then I looked at Courtney. "If you have a problem with me, call me. Don't make Trevor the messenger, and don't build a case against me from things you never heard me say." Neither interrupted. "If I'm not at a family event, nobody invents a story about why, and Sophie does not become leverage because adults are angry with each other. Ever." Trevor swallowed. "Okay." Courtney looked down at the keepsake box, then back at me. "I'm sorry, Kenneth." Trevor followed, quieter. "Me too, Dad." I heard the words. I appreciated them. But I had spent too many years accepting words as repairs when they were only promises to repair. An apology could be spoken before Christmas dinner was cold. What I needed to know was whether either of them could live differently after the words were over. The weeks after Christmas taught me more than anything Trevor or Courtney had said that night. Trevor did something I had never asked him to do. He went back through the family group and corrected the story himself. He wrote that I had driven to North Carolina for Sophie's birthday, that he had asked me to leave, and that the rocking horse had ended up in the trash because of a decision he made. He did not blame Courtney. He did not call it a misunderstanding. I read the message once and put my phone down. For the first time, my son had cleaned up something without waiting for me to hand him the broom. Courtney changed more quietly. The Sunday video calls returned, but she no longer treated them like rewards that could be withdrawn whenever we disagreed. Every few weeks, she sent me another photograph for the keepsake box. Sophie laughing in the bathtub. Sophie asleep against Trevor's shoulder. Sophie standing in snow for the first time with one mitten missing. Denise and Paul stayed close to their daughter, as they should have, but Denise made one thing clear to everyone. Their home would not be used again to make one side of Sophie's family disappear. I appreciated all of it, but I did not make the mistake of turning improvement into surrender. My life had changed too. I returned regularly to the woodworking group. I took a commission for a dining table from a young couple who wanted something sturdy enough to survive children they did not have yet. Linda and I started having dinner twice a month with old friends. When Trevor invited me down for a weekend in February, I already had plans to help the group finish toy boxes for a local community center. Years earlier, I would have canceled without thinking. This time I said, "I can't make that weekend." There was a pause. I expected him to sound hurt. Instead, he said, "Okay, maybe next month." That simple answer meant more than he probably knew. By early spring, Trevor called one evening with a question I had never heard from him before. "Dad, would it be okay if we came to you?" I looked out the kitchen window toward my workshop. "All three of you?" "Yeah. We can get a hotel nearby if that's easier." I smiled despite myself. "There's room here." The following Saturday, Trevor's car turned into my driveway after the same 8-hour trip I had once made in the opposite direction. I did not mention the symmetry. I did not have to. Trevor looked tired when he stepped out and stretched his back. Courtney carried Sophie toward the porch. "That drive is longer than it looks on a map," Trevor said. "It is," I answered. Sophie saw me and began kicking both feet until Courtney put her down. She ran the last few steps in the uneven way toddlers do, more momentum than balance, and wrapped her arms around my leg. Later that afternoon, Trevor followed me into the workshop. He stood looking at the tools for a while before saying, "Could you teach me to make something for her?" I glanced at him. "What do you want to make?" "I don't know. Something she can keep." We settled on a small bookshelf for Sophie's room. Simple enough for a beginner, useful enough to matter. Trevor assumed we would finish it before dinner. He measured one side wrong within the first hour. The following morning, he cut another board short. He stared at the wasted piece with the kind of irritation I remembered from his teenage years. Once, I would have stepped in and corrected everything before he could become discouraged. Instead, I handed him another board. "Measure again." He came back the next month to continue. Then again, he sanded until his shoulders hurt. He learned that a corner that looked square from 6 feet away could be wrong by enough to ruin the next step. He started over more than once. Courtney never mocked the delays. She brought Sophie into the workshop doorway, let her wave at us, then took her back outside so Trevor could finish what he had started. One Saturday, while he was smoothing the final shelf, he stopped and looked across the shop at the repaired rocking horse. "Dad? Yeah? How long did Sophie's horse take you?" I ran my hand across the edge of the workbench. "Longer than the drive." Trevor looked down at the sandpaper in his hand and nodded. He did not apologize again. He did not need to. When the bookshelf was finally finished, one upper corner sat slightly out of true. Trevor noticed it immediately. "I can redo that side." "Is it safe?" I asked. "Yeah." "Then leave it." He smiled faintly. "You would have fixed it. Once." That afternoon, I carried the rocking horse into the living room and set it in front of Sophie myself. She touched the handles first, then looked back at me before Trevor helped her climb on. Beside it stood the bookshelf her father had made with his own hands. Courtney took out her phone. For a moment I watched her through the same lens I had carried since September, wondering what she would move, what she would crop, what version she would choose. She took one photograph exactly as the room was. The rocking horse stayed in the frame. So did Trevor's uneven bookshelf. So did me. They threw the first gift into the trash because they thought it was only wood. The second gift showed them what they had really thrown away. And by the time my son learned what love costs to make, I had learned something too. Being his father never required me to make myself disposable. What stayed with me most was not the sight of that rocking horse in the trash. It was the realization that love can become dangerous when people mistake kindness for permission. For years, I thought being a good father meant absorbing disappointment, forgiving quickly, and keeping the family comfortable even when I was the one being hurt. I learned that peace built on silence is not really peace. It only teaches the person causing the harm that there is no price for doing it again. Trevor and Courtney did not change because I humiliated them, threatened them, or took something away from them. They changed because I finally stopped helping them hide from the truth. If you ever find yourself in a family where your love is taken for granted, do not rush to destroy the relationship, but do not erase yourself to preserve it either. Speak clearly. Keep your dignity. Let people own the choices they make. Do not lie to protect someone who keeps hurting you, and never allow children or grandchildren to become bargaining tools in adult conflicts. At the same time, leave room for real change when it is proven through consistent actions, not just emotional apologies. Forgiveness can be generous, but trust should be rebuilt slowly. In the end, the greatest lesson I carried from all of this was simple. Family should never be measured by who controls the invitation, the photograph, or the story. It should be measured by respect, honesty, effort, and the willingness to make room for one another without asking anyone to become smaller just to belong.